For this video, we're going to go over the idea of community interactions. So we're going to start by looking at the prefix inter. That means among or between. And when we apply that to interactions among or between different species, like hawk and owls, they compete for similar resources like nesting sites and food sources. So we're going to be dealing with interspecific competition. Interspecific competition is defined as the interactions that occur when individuals of different species compete for limited biotic and abiotic resources within an ecosystem, and that's going to limit their species growth and survival. Another example of that would be here with this lioness defending her kill from the hyenas. Two different species competing for the same resource. So the concepts of interspecific competition play an important role in the regulation of natural populations and the structuring of ecological communities. So what happens in a community when two different species compete for the same limited resource? This was actually tested in a famous experiment where two protozoan species, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium cadantum, were used as model organisms. When grown individually in the laboratory, they both thrive. Both of their populations increase. But when they're placed together in the same habitat, in this case, a test tube, look what happens. When they compete for the same resources, the P. aurelia continues to increase, but they outcompete the P. cadantum for food and space. They reproduce faster because they happen to be smaller organisms, so they need less food to be successful because the Paramecium cadantum are slightly larger and need more food to be successful. And that leads to this elimination that you see here, or eventually even extinction of one of these two species in that environment. So when they're grown together, the P. cadantum population is not as successful, and obviously their population declines. One species uses their niche, and some people pronounce that as niche. It's their role or their functional position in an ecosystem. So one species uses their niche more efficiently and therefore has an evolutionary edge, and they outcompete the species in a similar role. This illustrates the principle of competitive exclusion. If the resources cannot support both populations, then lower fecundity, or natural ability to produce offspring, and lower survival will result in at least one of the species being eliminated in that role in the ecosystem. And in that case, it happened to be our P. cadantum. And this means that interspecific competition has the potential to alter populations, communities, and evolution of interacting species. So this leads to something known as resource partitioning. This is when species alter their use of their niche to decrease direct competition by dividing resources among them. This allows similar species to coexist in a community. And you can think about this like the ghost of competition past, an indirect evidence of earlier interspecific competitions resolved by the evolution of niche differentiation. We saw in the last slide two similar species cannot exist in the same ecological space if they compete for similar resources. So evolution by natural selection results in similar species using a different set of resources. The flamingo, in this case, feeds on microorganisms in the mud. The duck dives for crustaceans and mollusks, and even aquatic vegetation. The avocet goes ahead and skims the mud and the surface water for small insects and even small seeds. The oyster catchers go ahead and feed on clams and mussels and shellfish, which they actually pry open with their very long and narrow beaks. And then the little plover. They feed on insects and tiny crustaceans, but they go ahead and they do this on the sandy beaches. So by these similar species using the limited resources in different ways, because evolution selected for resource partitioning, these similar species can coexist in the same ecological community. As a result of competition, a species' fundamental niche, which we see right here, which is the niche potentially occupied by that species, in other words, where it could live, is different than its realized niche, or where it does live. And that realized niche is driven by a set of conditions that dictate where it actually can survive. So for example, although these birds that we see here all have a fundamental niche that would be potentially this entire tree, in actuality, they spend their time eating in different parts of the conifer. So their realized niche is different elevations of the tree. The Cape May warbler, they feed on the invertebrates at the tip of the branches near the top of the tree. The bay-breasted warbler, they feed on larvae of many beetles in more of the middle of the tree. And the myrtle warbler, they feed more at the base of the tree. And they can eat insects or numbers of fruits, particularly bayberry and wax myrtle, which their digestive systems are uniquely suited amongst the warblers to digest. So where they could live is very different than where they actually live. And that's a direct cause of this competition. So closely related species whose populations are sometimes allopatrically or geographically separated, and sometimes sympatrically or geographically overlapping, provide even more evidence with competition within communities. So in allopatric populations, for example, are G. fuliginosa on the island of Los Hermanos and G. fortis on the island of Daphne, have very, very, very similar beak morphologies, probably because they eat similar seeds. But when they live separately, right, like we see here, you can actually tell that their beaks are then similar. And when they're found together, like on the island of Santa Maria, right, that's with sympatric, something interesting happens. There are limited resources that they're competing for, and their fundamental niche is being challenged. So they could no longer eat, what they could eat is no longer what they will eat because of this competition for the resources, and that's so heightened by them both being present on the island. That island is where their habitat overlaps. So the G. fuliginosa have shallower and smaller beaks, and the G. fortis over here that we see in green, they're going to have deeper and larger ones. And why? Because of resource partitioning, right? It's selecting for adaptations that favor specializing in eating different sized seeds. This phenomenon is called character displacement. And character displacement is the tendency for characteristics to diverge more in sympatric populations of two species than in allopatric populations of the same two species. And that is, again, exactly what we can see here in this graphic. So species can partition their niches not just in a space like with our warblers, but with roles in the ecosystem too. Think back to our example of interspecific competition among these mammalian carnivores. Especially with carnivores, there are particularly strong ecological effects because it may involve direct and aggressive interaction due to their morphological and behavioral adaptations for killing. An interspecific competition among carnivores is usually asymmetric in that it doesn't really have an equal impact on each competitor. For example, the larger competitor, in this case our lion, is usually going to win. The lions are much larger. They're at 130 kilograms versus hyena, which are about only, I think, around 50 kilograms. So they have evolved to acquire food in a different manner. Lions use pack hunting strategies to take down prey. And although hyenas can do that, they tend to use scavenging techniques as well. This idea of niche differentiation also applies to other mammalian carnivores in Africa. So for example, cats like cheetah, they have evolved to use speed, while cats like leopards have evolved to use ambush strategies to take down their prey. They have specialized in how to hunt. So this niche differentiation helped reduce the direct competition between the different species of predatory carnivores. Species can partition their niches in other ways too. Think back to our example of the owl and the hawk. They share a similar microhabitat and food resources, right? But hawks are diurnal, they're active during the day. And owls are nocturnal, they're active at night. And this change in behavior suggests that the competition existed between these species and that the partitioning of their active time helped them coexist in the same habitat, just at different times of day. So the idea of competition can be seen driving evolution across the board. And another example where we can see competition in action is the idea of ecological succession. And this is the process by which the structure of a biological community can change over time. Now, there are two types of succession. The first is primary succession. This occurs when the soil was destroyed and only bare rock is left. That can happen either through a volcanic eruption or a retreating glacier or even newly formed sand dunes. But that means that you need to build up the soil first. So organisms that can colonize this area will be those that can live in such an environment. They usually replicate very, very fast, and these first inhabitants are what we call pioneer species. These would be examples of lichen and bacteria. And not only do they help build up soil, but as they live and then they die, their bodies become soil. And over the years, where this continues to happen, they build up, they die, they add to the soil. This soil can start to support simple plants like grasses. As these live and die, the grasses further modify the soil, which can then be colonized by other types of plants. And eventually you get to shrubs, and each successive stage modifies the habitat by altering the amount of shade in the composition of the soil. Those plants that can outcompete the others are selected for when resources like light and water and nutrients are competed for. For example, if a tree species in a dense forest grows taller than the surrounding tree species, it's then able to absorb more of the incoming sunlight. However, that less sunlight is going to, or now this less sunlight is available for the trees that are basically left. And they are going to be, then the smaller ones are going to be shaded by the taller trees. And then again, what you have here is this interspecific competition. And one species outcompetes the other until you reach the final stage of succession, which is called a climax community, which is very stable, and that can actually endure for hundreds of years. The other kind of succession is secondary succession, and that occurs in areas that have experienced a disaster, like a forest fire, but the soil remains intact. So you would start here instead of primary ecological succession, which literally has to start from the bare rock. So this still takes time, all right, and the successive stages still modify the habitat, but you're starting from a different point. Okay, so that is the beginning of looking at community interactions with a focus on interspecific competition. Hope that is helpful.